In the savage arena of medieval power struggles, few deaths were staged to deliver a message as unmistakably horrifying as the fate that awaited Hugh Despenser the Younger in November 1326. His cries pierced the air of Hereford as his executioners meticulously dismantled more than just his physical form. They obliterated his identity as a man. This wasn't simply an execution. It was a choreographed act of vengeance, degradation, and political spectacle that jolted even a society hardened to public cruelty. Hugh Despenser had ascended from minor aristocracy to become the most dominant figure in England, second only to King Edward II himself. For more than 10 years, he commanded a level of authority that caused earls to flinch and queens to conspire in secret. But when Queen Isabella finally retaliated, she ensured that Despenser's downfall would reflect the very mercilessness he had dispensed to others. The execution method was selected not for its speed, but for its sheer agony and symbolic annihilation. Medieval chroniclers, typically restrained in their depictions of violence, described Despenser's death with rare detail and barely disguised glee. They understood they were not merely witnessing a man's end, but the violent collapse of one of England's most chaotic political eras. The savagery of his demise reveals everything we need to understand about the dread and loathing he provoked during his lifetime. What allows a minor nobleman to become the unseen ruler of a kingdom, and what kind of rule merits such a cruel and theatrical end? The saga of Hugh Despenser is one of unbridled ambition, royal indulgence, and the steep cost of unchecked authority. His climb was dazzling, his grip on power total, and his fall utterly ruinous. Today, we journey into the murkiest depths of medieval England to expose the grim tale of the king's favorite who reached too high. This is the account of how political lust turned fatal, and how medieval justice could be more horrifying than any torture device ever invented. Hugh Despenser the Younger entered the world around 1886, born into a society where loyalty to the monarchy could lift a lineage to extraordinary heights or crush it into ruin. His father, Hugh Despenser the Elder, had already made the family known as adept courtiers and merciless strategists. The younger Hugh inherited not only his father's name, but also his sharp intellect and dangerous hunger for influence. The England into which Hugh was born was a nation in flux. Edward I, the relentless hammer of the Scots, had passed in 1307, leaving the crown to his son, Edward II. The new monarch stood in sharp contrast to his warlike predecessor, preferring pastoral hobbies and the companionship of male favorites over managing a kingdom. This void at the center of authority opened the door for men like Hugh Despenser to make their move. Edward II's rule began mired in scandal, largely due to his relationship with Piers Gaveston, a Gascon knight who became the king's closest ally and rumored lover. Gaveston's pride and the king's obvious bias toward him infuriated the English nobles, who watched their own sway diminish in favor of this foreign newcomer. The baron's wrath eventually led to Gaveston's execution in 1312, but his death only left space for someone even more ambitious, and Hugh Despenser was ready. In contrast to Gaveston, who was viewed as an outsider, Hugh Despenser was undeniably a member of the English aristocracy. He possessed the political acumen Gaveston lacked, recognizing that real strength wasn't in flaunting royal favor, but in embedding oneself deep within the mechanisms of power. While Gaveston had been satisfied with titles and riches, Despenser aimed for something more perilous: actual control over governance itself. By 1318, Hugh Despenser had secured a spot within the king's inner circle, becoming Edward II's new favorite, and perhaps, many whispered, his lover. But Despenser brought to the relationship a degree of calculation and ambition that dwarfed Gaveston's influence. He didn't merely wish to be close to the king, he intended to become the king's voice, his will, and eventually his de facto replacement. The evolution of Hugh Despenser from noble courtier to ruler in all but name began with his elevation to crucial roles within Edward II's government. By 1322, he had become chamberlain, granting him constant access to the king and control over who else could gain an audience.
This role became the cornerstone of his dominance, enabling him to control information flow, sway decisions, and increasingly isolate Edward from other counselors. His tactics were cold and calculated. He identified which nobles posed threats, then methodically eliminated them using legal sleight of hand, economic coercion, and when needed, brute force. Those who stood against him often saw their lands seized on dubious charges, their relatives thrown in prison, and their ancestral privileges revoked through convoluted readings of feudal law. Despenser developed a particular fixation on the Welsh marches, which became the main source of his accumulating wealth. These borderlands, traditionally ruled by semi-independent lords, were rich in property and resources. Using his influence with the king, Despenser manufactured conflicts with the Marcher lords, then seized their holdings when they were driven out or defeated. In just a few years, he assembled a private domain that rivaled that of the crown itself. What made Despenser especially formidable was his mastery of administration and legal manipulation. Unlike earlier royal favorites who relied solely on the monarch's shield, Despenser created a framework of legal rationalizations for his deeds. He packed judicial bodies with loyalists, skewed parliamentary outcomes, and constructed a record of documentation that gave his land acquisitions and political purges a cloak of legality. This strategic use of the system often left his victims unable to oppose him, not because they lacked will, but because they had no legal grounds to fight back. By 1324, Hugh Despenser had effectively taken control of England, wielding power in all but official title. Edward II, increasingly reliant on the advice and affection of his favorite, rarely made any significant decisions without first seeking Despenser's input. Foreign envoys reported that meetings with the king were meaningless unless Despenser was present, and that the true discussions took place in private with the favorite. The established aristocracy found themselves completely sidelined from governance, reduced to mere onlookers in a realm they once directed. Despenser's rule was characterized by a deliberate campaign of fear against anyone who dared defy him. His opponents didn't just suffer political exclusion, they faced total obliteration. The Earl of Lancaster, among the most influential lords in England and a royal cousin, was executed in 1322 after challenging Despenser's authority. His death sent a chilling warning. Even royal lineage could not shield those who opposed the favorite. Despenser's treatment of enemies went beyond removal. It was calculated to degrade and inflict prolonged suffering. Nobles who resisted him were not simply executed or banished. They were first disgraced through rigged trials packed with invented accusations, forced to witness their families imprisoned or ruined, and subjected to punishments crafted to shatter their will before ending their lives. The psychological torment often proved even more effective than physical coercion. Despenser's vast web of spies and loyalists reached into every corner of English life. Servants in noble homes, clerks in official posts, and even members of the clergy were either enlisted or compelled into working for his intelligence network. This bred an atmosphere of constant suspicion where no conversation was private and no pact entirely safe. The old ties of feudal loyalty began to unravel beneath the weight of Despenser's surveillance state. Women were not spared Despenser's brutality, and many endured even worse treatment. The wives and daughters of his adversaries became bargaining chips, jailed in harsh conditions, or forced into politically expedient marriages. Lady Alice Dacey, England's most wealthy heiress, was effectively abducted and made to live under Despenser's control so that he could manage her vast properties. These violations of noblewomen flouted the chivalric ideals supposedly central to aristocratic conduct and intensified the fury directed at his regime. The possibly most alarming was Despenser's contemptuous treatment of the church and its leaders. Despite the era's deep veneration for ecclesiastical authority, he had no qualms about jailing bishops, seizing church lands, and bending canon law to serve his ends. When Bishop Adam Orleton of Hereford dared to criticize political policy, Despenser had him arrested and tortured. This irreverent conduct stunned contemporaries and added charges of sacrilege to the already damning case against him. The tipping point came with Queen Isabella herself. Edward II's queen, daughter of the King of France and a towering figure in European politics, found herself steadily pushed aside and degraded by Despenser's growing grip on her husband. The favorite's disdain for her was open, blocking her from accessing Edward and gradually cutting her household and finances. But Isabella was not one to retreat quietly. In 1325, she was dispatched to France to negotiate with her brother, King Charles IV, regarding contested lands in Gascony. This diplomatic assignment offered her the chance to slip from Despenser's control and begin organizing a revolt against his dominance. Once abroad, she began to rally support from English exiles and alienated nobles who had escaped Despenser's reach.
Her movement gained real momentum when she allied with Roger Mortimer, one of the Marcher lords who had evaded Despenser's previous crackdowns. Isabella's propaganda assault on Despenser was both straightforward and devastating. She cast herself as the wronged queen, driven out of her kingdom by the unnatural sway of her husband's favorite. She spotlighted Despenser's disregard for law and tradition, his assaults on the church, and his destruction of noble lineages. Most effectively, she portrayed him as a foreign blight upon English values, despite his native birth. The Queen's message struck a deep chord across Europe, where many were well aware of the dangers posed by royal favorites and the instability they brought. Isabella presented herself as the guardian of rightful governance against tyranny, and her cause drew support from nobles, traders, and commoners alike who had suffered under Despenser's oppressive rule. By 1326, she had raised an army and prepared to return to England. The invasion itself proved almost anticlimactic. When Isabella came ashore in Essex in September 1326, she was hailed as a savior rather than repelled as an enemy. Ordinary people, worn down by years of Despenser's tyranny, flocked to her cause. More crucially, the nobility, once paralyzed by fear of Despenser, seized the moment to exact revenge and abandon Edward II en masse. Edward II and the Despensers fled west toward Wales, hoping to find safety in the territories where Hugh's authority had been most entrenched. But even in these strongholds, loyalty eroded, as local leaders concluded that their futures lay with the Queen, not with a disgraced monarch and his hated advisor. The empire of intimidation and favoritism that had sustained Despenser's dominance collapsed like sand underfoot when faced with true opposition. Hugh Despenser the Elder was the first to be captured, taken by Isabella's forces as he attempted to hold Bristol Castle. His death was quick yet gruesome. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered as a traitor, his severed head displayed on London Bridge as a stark warning. Yet this was merely the prelude to the fate that awaited his son. Hugh Despenser the Younger was finally seized near Llantrisant in Wales on November 16, 1326. Contemporary sources depict him as already shattered by the disintegration of his empire. The man who had ruled England through fear for over 10 years was reduced to a broken figure, reportedly attempting suicide rather than endure capture. His captors, however, were determined that he would not be granted such an escape from judgment. The outcome of Despenser's fate was never in question, but the specifics of his execution were carefully orchestrated. Queen Isabella and her allies recognized that his death needed to achieve several objectives. It had to fulfill the thirst for vengeance among his numerous victims, act as a warning to future royal favorites, and symbolically purge the realm of his corruption. The execution they arranged was a triumph of medieval political spectacle. On November 24, 1326, Hugh Despenser was brought to Hereford for his final act. The selection of this site was deliberate. Hereford lay in the Welsh marches where his authority had been most entrenched, and it was the diocese of Bishop Adam whom Despenser had tormented. The crowd that assembled was vast, drawn not merely for gruesome interest, but for a sincere longing to see justice delivered to their tormentor. Despenser was denied the formality of a trial, though a list of his offenses was publicly recited before the gathered masses. The catalogue was long: treason against the monarchy, seizure of crown lands, oppression of noble families, assaults on the church, and the perversion of the king's natural inclinations. Each accusation drew loud approval from the crowd, who had long awaited this moment of reckoning. The executioners had been thoroughly prepared for their task, which they approached with the discipline of seasoned artisans. This was not intended to be a mere beheading or hanging. It was constructed as a public statement about what awaited those who subverted the kingdom's natural order. Every element of the punishment was symbolic, and each cut was intended to prolong agony while maintaining awareness.
Despenser was first stripped of his clothing and paraded through the streets of Hereford, exposing the vulnerable form of the man who had held them in terror for so many years. The once dominant favorite, now reduced to trembling flesh, became the focus of mockery and loathing. Satirical chants about his relationship with the king rang out from the spectators, and garbage was hurled at his exposed body. The execution began with Despenser being dragged behind a horse through the town, his body striking against stones and rubble. This initial torment weakened him physically while providing grim amusement to onlookers. By the time he reached the scaffold, he was bloodied and semi-conscious, but the true punishment was still to come. Despenser's execution was intended to systematically strip away his identity as a man, a noble, and a human being. The first stage saw him hung by the neck, though not to the point of death. The rope was adjusted to ensure pain and unconsciousness without causing a fatal end. As he dangled gasping for air, the crowd roared with approval at the man who had once held power over their lives. Once he was cut down, barely alive and only faintly aware, the second stage commenced. In a pointed insult to his supposed relationship with King Edward II, the executioners castrated him, slicing away his genitalia and casting them into a fire prepared for that purpose. This act was both literal and symbolic. It represented the severance of his unnatural bond with the king and inflicted the deepest form of degradation. This was followed by embalmment, as his abdomen was slit open and his internal organs slowly drawn out while he remained alive. The medical knowledge of the time was sufficient to prolong life through this procedure, and the executioners were practiced in extending the torment. His heart was eventually removed and thrown into the flames, signifying the destruction of his corrupt emotions and treasonous intent. Throughout the ordeal, Despenser remained semi-conscious, his cries mixing with the crowd's jubilation. Chroniclers of the era remarked that he appeared to attempt speech, perhaps to plead for mercy or offer a final confession, but his words were drowned by the noise of his pain and the people's celebration. The man who had once silenced all others with a word now found his own voice lost in the uproar of his torment. The execution concluded with the quartering of his body. His limbs were fastened to horses and torn from his torso in a dramatic display of destruction. His head was severed and mounted on London Bridge, placed beside that of his father as a cautionary example. The rest of his remains were sent to different cities across the realm, ensuring that the spectacle of his fall was witnessed throughout the kingdom. The immediate period following Despenser's execution was marked by a blend of public rejoicing and behind-the-scenes political realignment. The people of Hereford celebrated long into the night, treating the occasion more like a carnival than a solemn punishment. Ballads and satirical verses mocking the deceased favorite spread quickly across the country, many laced with overtly sexualized imagery intended to further degrade his legacy. Queen Isabella acted swiftly to solidify her authority and justify her insurrection. Just weeks after Despenser's death, King Edward II was compelled to relinquish the crown to his son, the young Edward III. With Isabella assuming the role of regent, the official stance held that she had delivered England from the grip of corrupt advisors and restored proper governance. Despenser's execution was framed as a rightful act of justice rather than simple revenge. The emotional toll of Despenser's downfall on the English aristocracy was deep and enduring. The theatrical and brutal nature of his death served as a stark caution to any future royal favorites who might aspire to amass similar dominance. For many years, those at court remembered Hugh Despenser's fate when weighing how far they could influence feeble monarchs. The economic aftermath of his demise was equally transformative. His enormous holdings were divided among Isabella's backers, dramatically altering the balance of power among the English nobility. Clans that had suffered under his tyranny suddenly regained their fortunes and prominence, while those who had allied themselves with him were left disgraced and dispossessed. Internationally, the effects were substantial. Royal courts across Europe had followed Despenser's rise with a mix of intrigue and dread, and his eventual execution was widely interpreted as a triumph of rightful authority over despotism. Isabella's successful uprising served as an example to other noblewomen and aristocrats confronting similar dangers from unprincipled favorites and ineffectual kings. The legacy of Hugh Despenser the Younger's death extends well beyond the medieval period, influencing broader discussions on political violence and state control. His execution stands as one of the most calculated and symbol-laden in England's history, crafted not merely to end a life, but to deliver a clear warning about the hazards of unchecked ambition and the abuse of royal influence. The method of his death, incorporating hanging, castration, evisceration, and quartering, became the standard punishment for high treason, remaining embedded in English legal practice until the 1700s. The legal implications of his case helped shape the future handling of treason charges, embedding the memory of his torment deep within the structure of English law. Historians still debate the scale of Despenser's misconduct and whether the nature of his punishment truly fit the crimes. While few attempt to excuse his behavior during his years in control, many suggest that the savagity of his execution says as much about the vengefulness of his enemies as it does about his own cruelty. His death arguably coarsened the political culture of England, reinforcing the use of brutal violence as a tool for governance. The sexualized elements of his punishment, especially the castration, reflect prevailing medieval perceptions of homosexuality and the perceived threat posed by inappropriate bonds between men in power. His fate became a warning tale about the dangers of sexual deviance influencing state affairs, a theme that resurfaced whenever suspicions arose about monarchs and their favorites.
The psychological dimension of Despenser's death also warrants attention. The methodical cruelty of his execution indicates that his foes needed not only to end his life, but to annihilate him utterly and disgracefully. This suggests a level of collective trauma and fury among both the nobility and the populace, accumulated over years of suffering under his regime. In reflecting upon the horrific execution of Hugh Despenser the Younger, we confront difficult questions about authority, retribution, and the darker instincts of human behavior. Questions that remain relevant far beyond the medieval world. His tale demonstrates how swiftly absolute power can deform even those born into privilege and refinement, turning them into figures of tyranny who treat others as either threats to eliminate or tools to exploit. The calculated cruelty of his end challenges us to reconsider what justice truly means and whether such suffering can ever be justified. Though Despenser undeniably inflicted great harm on many innocent people, the sheer spectacle of his punishment invites debate over whether any individual deserves such extreme torment and humiliation. The crowd's gleeful participation in his agony exposes the unsettling delight people can derive from witnessing someone they loathe.
The political insights drawn from Despenser's ascent and collapse remain pertinent even today. His narrative illustrates how structural vulnerabilities at the core of authority can allow ambitious figures to gain perilous levels of power through manipulation and coercion. The slow dismantling of legal safeguards and traditional boundaries that facilitated his despotism serves as a cautionary tale about the inherent fragility of democratic systems and the principle of lawful governance. Arguably more unsettling is how Despenser's rule made extreme conduct seem ordinary through a blend of intimidation, graft, and the incremental broadening of what society deemed tolerable cruelty. Many of his victims became unwilling collaborators in their own subjugation, ensnared in a regime where opposing the system was punished far more harshly than submitting to it. This pattern underscores how authoritarianism sustains itself by warping the ethical foundations of entire communities. The overarching message of Hugh Despenser's gruesome demise may lie in the realization that the boundary separating civility from savagery is alarmingly narrow. Despite the medieval context, his execution was orchestrated by learned, ostensibly Christian individuals who genuinely believed they were upholding justice. The swiftness with which they adopted calculated brutality under the guise of righteousness stands as an enduring reminder of humanity's potential for cruelty, irrespective of time period or cultural environment.